security sessions in this year's HNPW. My name is John Novakovic. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Interagency Security Forum. GISF and UNHCR are co-chairs of the Humanitarian Security Area of Common Concern at HNPW this year. Already last week, we've curated an important range of sessions on topics including security in urban environments, the use of private security companies by humanitarians, and a case study of Saving Lives Together implementation in Ethiopia. And I think that a few of those might be available recorded. So if you're interested in those, we can give you a link. The great levels of attendance and engagement that we've had in those virtual sessions do reflect how important safety and security is being seen at the moment. But we've tried to prioritise sessions for this in-person week where we believe there's a lot more to share between ourselves, where there's a chance for discussion. So I'd very much ask you to see yourselves as an active participant in this session. This session being optimising resources and collaborative strategies in field security for humanitarian impact, a reflection of the last year and of 2023. We have an excellent panel today who will reflect on what has been a particularly challenging 12 months for communities around the world, and in turn for the aid workers who support them. Dangers to staff and programs do not simply arise during armed conflict. The destabilisation that has led to and results from the 235 million people around the world requiring humanitarian assistance and protection is accompanied by a continually evolving series of risks. It's worth clarifying that colleagues in safety and security are focused on managing the risk to staff and programs. The protection cluster perform excellent work protecting and empowering the communities that we work with and for, but we focus on ensuring that the life-saving work can continue and sustainably reach those in need. The safety and security teams across the UN and NGO community are as restricted by resources as anyone in the sector. It's not a special issue for us, but in a specialised field, scaling up to meet demand quickly is difficult to say the least. But as with any aspect of life, major challenges often serve as a catalyst for innovation, for new ways of approaching problems. And particularly in the humanitarian sector, where we have the common refrains of saving lives together, coordination saves lives, etc. Challenges at this scale can prompt us to look at each other and say, hey, we're generally struggling with the same problems. Why don't we work together to find out a solution? Each member of our panel will speak for a short period to give their observations, reflections and thoughts before we open to the floor for what I hope will be a lively discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Paul Farrell. Paul is presently the Principal Security Coordinator and Director of Global Security for UNICEF. He is a strategic security risk management expert with 40 years of military and security experience, including 26 years in the United Nations. Paul is presently the chair of the UN Interagency Security Management Network Working Group on Security Risk Management, leading the way on collaboration between UN agencies. So Paul, thank you. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Good to see people in person. We were on a few panels last week virtually, but it's much nicer to be here in person. I'm going to make just a few comments. I'm going to keep it high level and not necessarily 2023 focused on some observations on how we look at optimizing resources. So the first thing that we look at in my organization is defining the security function, the function of decisions and actions meant to enable programs within acceptable levels of risk as something that can be done by more than the security people. So this idea that it should become part of the manager's portfolio and a manager's responsibilities is a great way of optimizing resources because we don't need professional security people everywhere. So this idea that the function has to happen regardless of whether you have a security person there with you is a way to make sure the function occurs everywhere. So that of course requires training and clear guidelines and knowledge and all the issues for these managers. But that's a great way to have a force multiplier of having the security function happen without having a large number of security. Now, in UNICEF, we do have security professionals, but we also rely on UNDSS in locations and other sources of information. But managers should be able to make the key decisions without having security people always there next to them. Now, speaking of DSS, obviously the next way we optimize resources is cooperating with partners and friends and colleagues, etc. So in the UN Security Management System context, that's DSS. It's all the other agencies like HCR and UN Women and all the other agencies here. And this cooperation is more than just exchanging information. It's also setting standard, agreed upon ways in which we look at problems, pooling resources, sharing individuals for different tasks, grouping together for missions, sharing assets, vehicles and things like that, as well as cost sharing things that we use together. So this sort of cooperative framework is key to optimizing resources. And as our chair already mentioned, saving lives together, interaction with NGO partners is also key to this optimizing resources. I won't touch on it in great detail, but definitely technology is important. The more we can use technology to make the managers and security advisors' time more efficient, to allow them to get away from their tasks and get involved in analysis and on the ground to see the problems and all that, the better. So use of technology to get people to use their time more effectively is very important. I'll make one final comment and I'll pass it back. One of the issues that a lot of people miss when it comes to optimizing resources, this is especially important for donors, is that investments in risk management, investments in security risk management actually save money in the long run. So what it does is it saves on loss, right? So if you don't have security risk management in place effectively, the environment will strip your money away through incidents and loss. So just by one example, I'll say that we all know the cost of security. Every time there's a budget somewhere, oh, this is what security costs. But no one has ever really detailed cost of incidents. What do failures of security really cost an organization? It's extremely complex, but it's not cheap. I'll give you one example only. In a large African operation we did 2000 something, we had 100 carjackings in a year. So if it's not really, but if the vehicle costs $30,000 and it's $30,000 to replace that vehicle, that's a $6 million loss. What would we pay upfront to lower that loss? So that's the final message I want to make is that if you invest well in security, it will save money for the programs. If not, the environment will strip that money away from you. So on that, I'll pass it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Next, I'd like to welcome Neil Elliott. Neil is currently the head of security for Oxfam International and has spent 30 years working in the humanitarian and aid sector in countries from Sierra Leone to Afghanistan and South Sudan. In the NGO sector, he has worked as a country director and team leader in many emergency responses. Neil also spent 5 years at DFID in the Conflict Humanitarian and Security Unit as part of DFID's humanitarian response team, adding a useful donor perspective to his thinking. Neil.
Thanks, John. I'm going to keep this started off simple, and then as we work down, bring up some subjects that could be quite more complex. So one of the key things for us, especially in the NGO sector, is proper budgeting. I think Paul already touched on it. Not everyone's a security professional. So to get proper resources, we need to make sure people almost have a template to put into their budgets. Because security people tend to have this thing, oh, I've got to go to the field and do an assessment. I'm not going to sit down and do a spreadsheet on the costs of doing risk management. So that's one of the things we try and do, is actually give them an idiot-proof guide to filling in a budget to be part of the proposal stage. Because that's one thing that always happens. Security people don't tend to be part of proposals. We don't look, when we're putting a new project, look at the risks and the costs of those risks. It is a budget line of 1 or 2%. So we try and make it easier for countries and emergency responses to have a proper budgeting template. And one of the things in that, which I'll come up in a bit later, is support to partners, to local partners, which is one of the key things I want to bring up on dealing with resourcing. The other thing that's trying to change is interdepartmental coordination. We all talk about enterprise risk management. in Oxfam, it's a dirty word, so we're having a common approach to risk, but it's actually where are our common approaches to risk. We have various departments doing their own risk assessments, cyber, safeguarding, the fraud team and security team is actually, we have a cost saving if we actually combine our ability to risk, use the same templates, the same methodologies, and actually can share the same personnel quite often. So that's a key thing that really pushing, rather than doing everything separately, multiplying your costs, but actually, let's look at a holistic approach to risk. Another thing that is getting much better lately is the interagency coordination. We have GISF, which is pulling together a lot of the international NGOs, not just from the humanitarian sector, but from the rights-based approach and reaching out to southern NGOs now more and more. Another thing, especially on like humanitarian responses, working with people like INSO and Mercy Corps, who give a lot of analysis. NGOs don't have a lot of money, but analysis is one of the key things that helps you actually develop your risk management strategies, knowing what's going on. So that work with those other agencies is very, very, it saves us a lot of time, therefore a lot of funding, but it's also good you have experts in reporting and analysis. So that's got better over the years. And the sharing we do, especially in rapid responses, I don't know if any of you know that part of GISF, they have an online app, Mattermost, that we can share information. Ukraine, Turkey, Gaza, a lot of talk. People reach out. Who's doing what? Where can I get the information? Who's done an assessment? Having that ability to almost real time asking your peers in other organizations is invaluable. And I find that, I use it occasionally, but most encourage my team to use it. And we do get a lot of good information sharing. And the other one is these regional security platforms. The one in Middle East and North Africa is what is really active. Again, sharing information, sharing resources. So having those NGO regional platforms, and I believe the one in MENA, UN are sitting in with that. So that's that, not so much saving lives together, but that regional concept of information sharing. And one of the other things, which is probably, we could be criticised for this, but I don't want to, is working through local partners. And we don't see it as risk transference. It's how do we work with local partners and how do we resource working with local partners? Because, especially for a lot of agencies now, going down the path of working with national and local NGOs are becoming more and more common. Syria in the non-government areas was a massive upscaling of working through local partners because international NGOs couldn't go into certain parts of Syria. How do we support those partners? How do we support them in their duty of care? Because this is the way it's going. For those of us that are part of the Pledge for Change, we are transferring more of the funding and the work to our local partners, or even like Oxfam becoming local NGOs themselves. How do we resource that? And that is becoming quite a big part of their work, and properly resourcing that is difficult because we don't necessarily understand the risk appetite of our local partners, or the fact they perhaps see risk differently than I come in from the UK, do a risk assessment, show it to a local partner, and they go, well, that means nothing to us. That's not our concerns, our risk. So it's getting the time and the space to actually learn from them what they see as the risks and supporting that. So I think that's, from my point of view, is what I want to say. And it'd be interesting, especially on the way we work with partners, it'd be interesting to see any questions on that. But that's basically, I think I'll shut up. That's what I have to say.
Thanks, Neil. Next, I'd like to welcome Florence Poussin. Florence is the Deputy Director of the Division of Regional Operations in UNDSS in New York. Ms. Poussin has served as Officer in Charge of the Strategic Planning and Policy Service in the United Nations Department of Safety and Security for 2 years, providing strategic support to senior management in all aspects of policies, communications, planning, oversight and partnerships. Ms. Besson joined the United Nations following 12 years of experience in the French diplomatic and security service in various positions. I'll pass to you.
Thank you. I would like to provide the perspective from UNDSS, so Department of Safety and Security, which covers the safety and security for UN personnel for globally. We cover and we support 160,000 personnel working for the UN. We are represented approximately in 130 countries. And when we had this, the title of this conference, Optimizing Resources, really this title resonated with me. So I really wanted to participate. Just to give a little bit of context, of course, I mean, you all know, but I just wanted to remind, what 2023 was for all of us. Coming from, the crisis in the Sahel to the surprise crisis and events in Sudan, the earthquake and natural disasters, that happened in Morocco and Turkey at the border with Syria, and then since October, the confrontation between Israel and Gaza, in the Hamas in Gaza. So we are confronted to not only violent conflict, but also natural disasters. We have to handle more and more conflict at the same time, more and more natural disasters at the same time. So how did we work on this basis with, the same resources over the last few years? One of the priority for the department was to increase our preparedness and our resilience, to be able to prepare to all of these crises, to not be in a crisis mode each time that there is a crisis that happens. So we have developed our resilience division or service, and also our emergency response. This is still, in progress, but this will allow us to be able to not only prepare but also respond to this crisis. The other pillar of this transformation is digital transformation. We are investing in our resources, in our digital, capacity through partnership, but also through partnership within the UN and outside of the UN as well. This is key to change the processes that we have to work better, at HQ and in the field. In the last few years, we have also developed the partnership. Paul mentioned some of the partnerships with the agencies, but maybe I'll be a little bit more concrete. There are a number of elements where we have worked together on crisis. We have prepared crisis management training with our colleagues in the agencies, and also with NGOs. Last week there was, or 2 weeks ago, crisis management training in Pakistan. That was the first in 2024. That was really, a cooperative effort between the agencies. WFP was there, a number of other agencies, and DSS as well. We try to do it differently as well. In the past, we would be doing crisis management training with a number of agencies participating, only focusing on the designated officials, for instance, those who are, making decisions on security. This time, for the last session on training, we merged the training for designated official and for the security officers at the same time. So that's how, we're trying to seek efficiencies. In another example of one of the great cooperation that we had as a system was a couple of years ago already, we started working together on emergency telecommunication. It was actually a seed starter, I would say, from the World Food Programme. We started to invest thanks to their leading position in the emergency telecommunication network. They allowed us to think more about, how we can improve our emergency telecommunication. That was then, transformed into an entire project, test project that is now supported in an interagency manner and completely cost shared by all the agencies, funds and programs of the UN system. So that's how, we improve and make concrete improvements as partners in the area of emergency communication. We have started also since last year to broaden our partnership, of course, through standby partnerships. We have established for the first time partnership with member states, with organizations, NGOs like IMAP, for instance, Radar, Canadair, etc., that allow us to increase our capacity in terms of analysis, strategic analysis on the ground. We have, for instance, this partnership in Ethiopia right now, in Afghanistan also building, and also in Israel and in working for Gaza. But optimization is one thing, but in a deteriorating environment and with the number of crises increasing, we do need to have more actually funding, and that's why we are also building up our capacity to raise funding. And I can tell you that we could not operate without them. In a country like Ukraine, we were lucky to get some funding from donors to help us immediately after the beginning of the war to establish our positions in Ukraine. One of the first things that we did, for instance, was to purchase, armored vehicles. The armored vehicles were already in stock. We were lucky to have them immediately after the beginning of the war. 20 vehicles arrived in Ukraine, who were helping the entire UN community to operate from Ukraine just after the war. So optimizing resources, collaborative strategy, but still, we still need to have this funding to operate in this deteriorating environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce Zina Abdin. Zina currently works for UN Women as the Deputy Regional Security Specialist covering Arab states and Asia and the Pacific regions, and is based in Cairo in Egypt. Before joining UN Women, she worked for UNHCR, UNDSS, and UN mission setups in countries including Ethiopia, Kuwait, and Jordan. So thank you, Zina.
Thank you, John. Good morning, colleagues. I'll be very brief, and in order not to repeat what my colleagues have said, I'm going to focus on a very successful example or process that UN Women follows to ensure optimized resources and efficient use of funds when it comes to emerging security and safety needs. Of course, UN Women, like all other UN agencies, was faced with rapidly deteriorating security situations in 2023 in many countries across the globe, such as Haiti, Gaza, Sudan, among others, also including in the past years. So these situations came with security and safety difficulties and challenges that needed prompt action and high levels of adaptability. In UN Women, we have adopted different approaches to tackle these needs or these challenging requirements. For example, we have collaborated with a sister UN agency to provide additional security measures like cost sharing, for example, an armored vehicle in Yemen with another agency, or loaning another to a sister agency in another jurisdiction. We have also used resources of UN agencies to meet urgent needs when we did not have enough assets or even human resources. As an example to that, we have explored options of cost sharing a security post with one of the agencies when the need to have a security professional in one of the countries emerged for when the situation has very quickly changed in that country. Also, during the Gaza conflict, we coordinated with the UNDSS to have our to receive and to relocate UN Women personnel from Gaza to Egypt because we didn't have enough assets and enough resources to do so. On the same issue, also we have collaborated with IOM to on the logistics arrangements and the transportation of UN women personnel from Rafah to Cairo. So all these innovative approaches of joining resources, of cost sharing, pooling, loaning, leasing, etc., proved to be very effective and very efficient and cost saving. However, at some points of time, we had, especially at certain operational levels, we at UN Women had to have our own resources, our own assets, our own people to deliver our programs and projects and ensure fulfillment of our mandate. For that, in UN Women Security and Safety Services, we adopt a very successful and efficient structured process that ensures high levels of compliance and secures funds for additional emerging security and safety needs. And allow me to elaborate a little bit on that. We have this, if we call it a three-phased process, where phase one being the security and safety compliance survey, which is completed not by security people, not by the security professionals, but by operations managers and heads of offices to confirm what measures are put in place in their locations, what security and safety measures are actually in place in their locations. And once this first phase is completed and validated, it takes us to the second phase, which we call the Security and Safety Compliance Action Plan, where these identified gaps, shortcomings, instances of non-compliance goes into the action planning, which has an embedded tool of like a list of security and safety measures from open sources with indicative cost. And so this helps us to match our needs with the cost estimates, which also takes us to the last stage of the process, what we call the security and safety compliance emergency funds. Now, this fund is a pre-budgeted compliance contingency fund that is managed by the Global Security Advisor of UN Women, who has the autonomy to use these funds effectively, of course, after following certain criteria, after ensuring that the country offices and the regional offices use their budgets wisely and effectively, and that security and safety are actually mainstreamed throughout the different stages of the programs, starting from the early stages of planning, implementation, budgeting, and so on. So this structured process that we use at UN Women proved to be very successful and efficient in ensuring high levels of compliance at early stages and ensuring actual implementation and securing additional resources, additional funds when for emerging security and safety needs. Thank you.
Thanks, Sina. The final panelist, before we go to some questions, is Gabriel Kamara, who is a UNHCR Senior Field Security Officer with over a decade's experience in the UN system and more than 2 decades in the Senegalese military. He works within UNHCR HQ's Field Security Service and has served as a Senior Field Security Officer in Chad and Mali. Before UNHCR, Gabriel served as a military expert for a UN human rights profiling project, and earlier as a military advisor to the MONUSCO mission in DRC. I'll pass to you, sir.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. You know, when reviewing the title, Optimizing Resources and Collaborative Strategies in Field Security for Humanitarian Impact, one cannot but think about, you know, the traditional model that we use, the framework for strategies, ends, ways, and means, right? Ends being, of course, the impact, sure. That's the raison d'etre of our organizations, humanitarian organizations. Ways being the way we do humanitarian work, principled, collaborative, etc. And of course, the resources, the means. It is important to have those means. I was expecting actually UNDSS to come up with the traditional motto of no program without security, no security without resources. That one is that's something that we have that's a doctrine actually for the security. It is indispensable. Costs are incompressible in security. But of course, there's more to it. There's a way to minimize the cost, there's a way to optimize also the resources. And I'll give some context to start with UNHCR specific way of doing business. In 2023, UNHCR has declared 43 new emergencies in 29 countries on top of all those emergencies existing. Neil, Rob, John, at the beginning, they talked about the specific situation that we are enduring right now. There's a lot of emergencies. And it's not only the numbers of emergencies, but we are operating in locations where we have protracted situations on top of new emergencies. Nearly a quarter of UNHCR staff is operating right now in high risk or substantial threat level in the world right now. And UNHCR and its partners, sister UN agencies, INGOs, etc., we are often operating in remote locations where there's not a lot of services, not only security services, but also part of it. There's not a lot of governance, there's not a lot of infrastructure, and it adds to the challenges where we operate. And of course, when there's no security services, what we used to say is, and that's actually the way we operate, that's the international law. The countries, the host nations have primary responsibility for security, but it's not already always there, always in place, either no willingness or no capacity actually to provide that security, not only for humanitarians, but of course, for everybody, the civilians, the forcefully displaced, all the vulnerable people we serve. Now, in those locations also, some other things that we need to point is there are scarce resources. We have people who are welcoming refugees who are living in very complicated situation, and there's often a competition over resources, and that adds to the complexity and the potential for spillover of conflicts from one country to another. So that added to the most absence of security services, it is a really complicated situation. Now, if you add the financial constraints of the organizations, that's ever-expanding volume of what we need to do in very complicated places. And then you have those resources that plumbing going down. It is really a challenging situation. We are often asked to do more with less, but at a certain point, it is incompressible. But yet we have found ways to do that. We are still staying and delivering in a lot of places. And ways in which we're doing that is, for instance, no longer seeing means as a function of resources, as a function of ends. So the resources no longer as a function of ends, but as a function of ways. That means better ways of doing business, either with technology or others. But again, also more integration. My fellow panelists have talked about it, breaking down silos and all those things, really integrating security into how we plan, how we do business. In UNHCR, internally, how we break down silos, one of those mechanisms that we have put in place that has been done already in the past is the multifunctional teams that we have. It is not only integrating security, but really all functions inside the organization to make sure we do business. We have broad ideas. And at some instances, it's not only even security can provide better ways of doing business, better way of providing humanitarian action. We have also increased partnerships, of course, under the leadership in a lot of places with UNDSS, with sister agencies, UNICEF, IOM, WFP. One of the things that we have put in place that has been existing for a while now is the workshop for emergency management, where we invite also a lot of INGOs. In that workshop for emergency management, we do have a security component with people being trained in and certified in safety and secure and safety approach to field environments. We do also have many other training, just like the WSAT, the Women Security Awareness Training that we do with sister agencies, but UNICEF has been on the forefront of that, inviting also many INGOs. So many things are being used right now to make sure we sort of pool resources. And of course, we do benefit from the resources of all other agencies in a way of having more impact. Internally, we also have nationalized posts, well, where it is appropriate. It's not only security posts, but it's really all over the place. In UNHCR, all functions. It's in line with the localization agenda we've been talking about. And that's a way also to cut costs, but it's not necessarily about always the cost, of course. We have reduced redundancies where they exist, unnecessary redundancies, because we know in security, at times it's important to have those redundancies. I can give the example of radio rooms that we have closed in some capital cities because we are still also participating under the local cost shared security budget under the leadership of UNDSS in the funding of the security operations centers, for instance. So finally, looping back into what I said in the beginning with the ends, ways and means, better ways of doing business, better ways of doing humanitarian work will save resources, but those resources are still incompressible. We cannot, of course, save lives by risking lives. There's still room for improvement in the way we do business. And again, that traditional motto stands, I think, no program without security, no security without resources. Even though the resources needs to be really cost effective because of the current environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we're now going to go to questions. Now, I do have quite a few questions to put to our panel. Two things. One, if you have any questions, please do put your hand up and we'll come to you. And the second is, feel free to also offer your own opinion to some of the questions that we'll put to the panel. This is, ideally, this is a discussion amongst all of us. So please feel free to contribute to the conversation. I'll just double check with Christian. There's none online at the moment. I can't see Christian, so don't worry about that. So the first one, I'm going to start with the negative question, or the more depressing questions first, before we look to the future, which is a very positive future. There's a general consensus that 2023 was a particularly challenging year for the humanitarian sector in terms of both safety and security, and for the need to stretch resources to meet the vast need. Can you think of a similarly difficult global period from the past? And did the way that we adapted at that time in terms of how we approach safety and security, in terms of change and innovation, did it result in long-term improvements to how we approach our work? Anybody like to have a go at that first? Neil.
I'm thinking back to 2012-13 with Syria, where we were asked to work in a very complex and changing security environment. And one of the first times, well, I was actually with DFID at the time, but donors were actually asking about your security risk management. And they were talking about duty of care. First time I've ever had heard donors actually directly speaking about duty of care for the international NGOs, the national NGOs. And that thinking's still there, and it goes in waves, but I think, that was a very challenging time for a fairly unique risk environment. But there was a conversation, and I know sitting in DFID, it went straight up to senior ministers to talk about the risk to humanitarian workers. I've never had that conversation before, and I've not really had that conversation after, but there is more awareness, I think, within a lot of the major donors about resourcing security risk management. How effective it is still questionable, but I think it's got better, but it's taken major conflicts, major global shifts to have that conversation. I don't know if anyone else noticed that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. As in a previous position, I had a chance to look at various previous reports of the Secretary General on the safety and security of humanitarian personnel. And the report mostly starts by, you know, the statement that the security situation over the years is more complex and deteriorating. So what has changed, right, since the start of TSS when we started to do this this report in 2005? I think for the UN, from the point of view of the UN, there has been quite a significant change. When we said at the beginning in 2005 or even 2009, 10, that the situation was more complex is because the UN was affected by terrorist attacks directly for the first time. And that was a tremendous change, sea change, that pushed us to look at security in a different way, to organize ourselves within the UN security management system. And then after, especially the terrorist attack that happened in Algiers, to look at a different set of policies. And that's where we really, as a UN system, started looking at building a framework of policies that would work and provide, you know, the framework for our operations at strategic level, but also at the operational level. So what has changed since that time? I think now, and particularly, you know, in 2022 and 2023, what we have seen is a number of complex situations accumulating, and that's where I think we are facing this issue of resources now.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to echo Florence's interventions. I was a regional security advisor for UNICEF in West Africa in 2002. This was the time of the Cote d'Ivoire Civil War. The Sierra Leone War was just ending. Liberia, we had the lured rebels attacking the city. All these things were happening. And now we look at what we're doing in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, etc. The difference, and we're going to get to this afternoon, so we're inviting everyone back to the adaptive planning session at 2 o'clock. But the difference is, even though it's a lot more happening, I think we're dealing with it more effectively. Florence mentioned earlier that not to be in crisis mode all the time. So even though there's more crisis, we're in less crisis mode because of the things we learned after Baghdad and Algiers, how to set things up properly, how to have proper risk assessments, how to train managers in decision making. And so I do see the environment is very complex, but I don't see as much internal crisis in the organization. We're doing a lot more effectively because we got our act together from our mistakes from before. Thanks.
Zena or Gabriel, any thoughts on that? Not everyone has to answer every question, don't worry.
I thought it was a question for all the people, that's why.
Yeah, please. Anyone in the room or online have any reflections on a key moment or a key catalyzing year which changed the way we approach humanitarian security? Sir.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Tracy. I'm from the UK. I was just curious because I think one of the watershed moments in this area was when 6 ICRC workers were killed in Chechnya in 1996. And that really seemed to change the security dynamic of who was safe and who was not, i.e. more people were unsafe. And I think it's very interesting that whilst we've talked about terrorism quite a lot, we don't seem to be able to distinguish the terrorism from the crime. And Paul started by talking about the number of vehicles that might be stolen. And I'm curious if the panel has any views on whether the bigger threat that they see is just ordinary criminality and the amount of violence that's used to pursue that criminality, or whether terrorism is the greater threat facing humanitarian workers.
Okay, I'll try. Thank you. I think, you know, So over the years, we have seen different patterns in the threats that the UN has been facing in particular. We have had, as mentioned, a number of big events, big terrorist attacks. Baghdad was one of them. Algiers was one of them. Nigeria as well was one of them. We still consider that the terrorist threat is an underlying threat against the UN. We have an increase in the number of direct attacks against the UN over the years. But we know that in terms of the impact, what is the most threat affecting the UN is criminality and acts of violence. This is something that, I mean, when we do risk assessment, we take everything into account, whether this is, higher or lower. This is part of our risk assessment. So I would not go into, what is the highest or the lowest. I think we have to take everything into account in our risk assessment and organize ourselves accordingly. Thanks.
I'm in a slightly different position because Oxfam is half humanitarian development and half advocacy and influencing. So do we see terrorism as our greatest threat? No. What we're seeing is the attacks on civic space. We're actually, the biggest risk to some of our work is the legal context we work in, the laws against NGOs, the law, and a lot of the work we do is LGBTQ rights. And the number of staff we have that are involved with that get attacked verbally, initially online, but some of those attacks end up being quite physical. We had people threatened with death. We've had to remove people from countries. So the threat environment for us is changing. The traditional bombs, bullets, and crime is still there. We're very good at managing that, but we're coming to an era of where we're actually dealing with legal frameworks that could end up putting people in prison, but also attacks online against your attitude, you're supporting gay rights, you're supporting Indigenous rights. So we're looking at those spaces, the risks around there. So the threat environment has changed. Terrorism, yeah, it's still there. Is it for an NGO like Oxfam one of our greatest risks? No. But, but I said, you've already said, we are actually good at dealing with those crises, so they're less of a major impact on us because we've been dealing with it for decades. But there's a new threats coming in that we're not so good at dealing with.
Thank you. And just to pick up on what you said, Neil, about Syria as an example of innovating and coping. I know I used to work for Mercy Corps, and that's where the in-house analytical capabilities started, developing conflict mapping and much more in-depth data-driven assessments, which we then rolled out to 10 different countries on the back of that. So building our ability. And as Paul said, I don't think, and you can pick up on that if you want, Paul, actually, before I go on, go, please. I was going to say, as Paul was saying, the capabilities and the knowledge has increased multiple times over. But then I was going to come into actually having the resources to implement those capabilities.
Yeah, I want to add a few points. I mean, thanks for the reference to Chechnya, right? So there's many different times, we couldn't all talk about everything, but definitely we see in the UN when it comes to hostage incident management, some different sea changes, right? So, and that's another area which we've adopted really well to try to keep ahead of this problem. There was definitely that situation in Chechnya. There was also the situation in the Middle East when we started getting beheadings on video, and we started talking about this is not a kidnapping, this is delayed murder, right? So these were all very complicated situations. What is unique about terrorism when it came to our learning is its impact on decision makers, right? Because there's so much fear and all this uncertainty involved in it, it has an outsized effect on the ability to have a rational approach to things, which is why and we'll get to this in other sessions, why a very structured approach to assessing situations can manage some of these fears and biases and things like that come with it. So even though it doesn't have on a numerical thing as much impact every time, if it's anywhere in the discussion, it has an impact on decision making. So I think that was very important. Also, when it comes to other areas like crime and things like that, it depends on how well we can manage it, right? And so the terrorism is the one instance where if you have a very capable, highly motivated antagonist trying to get you, it really challenges your ability to deal with it. It takes everything to be in one system. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of coordination to put your A team on this. And that's why it's very difficult and has a large impact on our ability to manage, but it isn't happening all the time. But we can't forget the effect it has on decision makers. Thanks.
Yes, just to add very quickly, yes, criminality, terrorism, of course, but there's one new trend that we have observed in Humanitarian, and I guess it may be specific to the type of business we're doing, is the civil unrest. With the resources being more scarce and scarce, and the beneficiaries not necessarily receiving the necessary aid. I talked about the conflict, the competition around resources against the backdrop of climate change, etc. So you have less aid being available for a lot of vulnerable people, especially in those areas where you have forcibly displaced people, and then you have also a local population who already face a lot of issues. So what we have witnessed is a growing number of discontentment with people, a lot of civil unrest, and of course the humanitarian workers being caught in between. It is more frequent. That's a very frequent thing we are observing. But of course, the impact, we are managing it right now, but it's something that will become more and more an issue as the resources go down again.
Sorry, I forgot to mention one thing, but thanks to Gabriel and Paul remind me of something important in terms of the changes that happen over the years as well. I think we are now also operating in completely different environment, in armed conflict environment, in a war, in situations of war. We are operating in Ukraine, we are operating in Gaza, and we are operating in Sudan. So it's a different situation from one single terrorist attack that happens, almost every year in Somalia, and we're still continuing to operate in Somalia. So I think it's really, we have adjusted over the years to the different threats. We have adjusted the way we operate, the way we coordinate ourselves, and the way we think about the threats as well. So it's important because I think that 15 years ago, actually, we would not have been operating in this environment, and we are now. So thanks.
And when we're reflecting on the new threat environment, we haven't even touched on cyber and digital threats, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole just now because that's a whole session in and of itself. Did any of your organizations, we've spoken about capability versus capacity. So capabilities have developed significantly in recent years. But in terms of capacity, did any of your organizations have to scale down a particular humanitarian response because you didn't have sufficient safety and security resources to satisfactorily manage the risk? Were there any particularly tough questions where it was unsure, where in the past it would usually be a straightforward answer?
So we are facing this tough decisions almost on a daily basis. And I must say that, the way we have been responding traditionally to the different crises has been through surges. So we send people, from one country to another country for a response to a certain crisis. But we have seen since 2022 and since the war in Ukraine that was not sustainable as a model. So that's why I mentioned, we're working on building up our emergency response to have a proper, system to surge personnel. But in addition to that, what we are committing to do is to do a global review of our resources that was done on an ad hoc basis, removing, one resources from one country to the other. But we are now building a system to do on a regular basis a global review of our resources. So it means that we'll have to, face the discontent of some of the country resident coordinators who are not happy that we are removing, security advisors from one country to put to another country. But there is a justification for that, that in these countries. Where we, I think, need to do better is probably looking at our regional efficiencies and the way we, build the efficiencies at the regional level. But that's something that we're working on.
Something we have faced, and increasingly, that's more on the operational level potentially. It is the difficulties in having access in a lot of places due to insecurity. That's the case in the Sahel, that's the case in Sudan right now, that's the case in Myanmar, and many other locations where we operate. Because of that difficulty to have access, we in UNHCR and other sister agencies, INGOs, most of the time we change the way we deliver. We're trying to find better ways of doing business, including through CBI, for instance, that's cash-based interventions, and some other ways. I think Neil talked about risk transfer, but of course it is responsible. It is really at the beginning of his interventions. It is really something that needs to be thought of as there's a comparative advantage in having this agency rather than us going to do this because the risk profile is better, etc. But again, there's much to it. Risk appetite is different, and risk management capacities also are different. But we try to do it in a way that is principled. Make sure also whatever new methods, new strategies we put in place to stay and deliver is something that allows us to continue to do work and have humanitarian impact.
We haven't not responded to any of the major crisis, but I think Gaza's made us realise that, we don't necessarily have the right resources in place for that sort of intense crisis, which is, basically like Ukraine facing a major global military power, which scares people. And do we have the right resources, the right people to go in there? And it was a major conversation in Oxfam, and something we are, like you said, DSS, we're going to do a review. How do we resource and do better rapid onset emergencies that are in, a high risk zone? So it's has not stopped us, but it's made us think. One of the things that has stopped us, which isn't really security related, is the global insurance market, but that's another conversation. That's what's hampered us in Ukraine and in Gaza for getting international staff in. That's caused us a lot of problems. But that's, as I said, that's like cyber, that's one to park. But that's what stopped us being responding rapidly in a couple of incidents lately.
So we've listed a number of interesting innovations, ways to stretch the dollars. And I think this question is interesting because you're all operating in different contexts and at different parts of your organizations. Where do you get these ideas? Have they been in your back pocket for a while, and it's not until you reach these crunch points that you're able to justify them? Are you pulling on your experience from other industries? Are you discussing with your network, collaborating? Where are you coming up with these new ways to approach the problems? Zena, do you want to start with you?
In order to use our resources well, we had, as I have mentioned, emergency funds. We had we ensure mainstreaming of security and safety throughout our programs. We have also capacitated our team who functions in different, who covers different functions, not only security, but also operational safety and health, and also business continuity and crisis management. So we had plans to capacitate and qualify the different team members to cover the different functions by sending them on training, doing capacity building exercises, and so on. And this does not only cover the security professionals or the security team, but it was also extended in many instances to operations staff, to program staff. For example, we have sent the colleagues from program from Women's Peace and Security section on security training courses in order to enhance our capability and support to the security team, and that especially when we did not have in some duty stations, we did not have country level security specialists. So yeah, so we use the funds we have, and also supporting other colleagues, not necessarily from the security team. And since we have these mechanisms that ensure compliance across the organization, the more the compliance is, there's increase in compliance, but there's decrease in funds or the need for funds. Of course, compliance differentiates, changes from time to time based on the developing operational contexts, but that's how we find also resources available to equip other team members in different functions. So it is the support is cross-functional and at different levels.
I'm going to pick up on that because I know that now you, Paul, Neil, Gabriel have all mentioned in different from different positions the concept of mainstreaming security throughout your organization. Gabriel, you spoke about breaking down silos. Neil talking about bringing in that enterprise risk management approach. And this is really important, I think, not just in having effective security, but in making resources go further. What support do you need? What are the barriers that you've found, depending on where you are in your journey, to getting that cultural shift where everybody feels like they have ownership on security within your organization? Paul, you sound like you're down that path a little bit. Did you have any thoughts on that? Who have you had to bully to get this through?
No, yeah. I mean, I think this issue of culture change is key. When you were talking about resources, I was thinking one of the things is not necessarily the resources availability, but whether we're using them effectively or efficiently, and a lot that comes down to human nature. And so selling the story for security also is one of the outputs of the failures that happened in Baghdad and Algiers. The reality that set in was helpful, but also what I saw after Algiers, for example, it was a big time when security was going to be almost sidelined because we weren't able to make a case that we're supporting resources and we're supporting enabling programs instead of being a drain on resources. So we really had to reanalyze and reconceptualize how we thought of security and how we sold it to managers in a way that got to the aha moment, I need this. I used one example earlier about the cost of loss versus the cost of security. And so that ability to be able to make a case, a business case for why you need to have security up in front was also what we learned. And that was part of the culture shift. And if we approach security only as a compliance and you have to do this, you have no choice, people react to these bad ideas and they're going to sideline them. It's more of becoming a partner in solutions that was really the way in which we could keep on at the table and have an influence.
Neil, you work in a unique organization, relatively unique, with Oxfam, where you have a number of satellite organizations, I suppose. How do you, from the NGO perspective, then make that business case, as Paul is saying?
Well, I'm just going through that process because there's actually 23 independent Oxfams that are literally, if they want to be totally independent, they all have a different way of working. Now, I sit in the global program team in the Secretariat, and I want to stay in that program team. I don't want to be put into operations programs because they then get to talk to the program directors, the program managers. The thing with Oxfam, and I'm just about to undertake this, is a complete review of our global security strategy, which is very interesting because it's an organisation that's going through a decolonisation process, yet they want a global security policy. It's engagement, and it's the engagement that we're going through. Who do we start to engage with? Is it the executive directors? Is it the middle management team? Is it the people at the coalface? The work, the people delivering the programs, or the people doing advocacy and influencing? And that's something I'm undertaking now. And it's who do we engage with? In fact, it's a whole different spectrum of people. But what we're doing, because I come from a program background, not a security background. My background is, working in South Sudan emergency response, is I can talk the program language when I need to. And that's how I've sort of always sold myself in this position. Why am I global security director or head of security when I'm actually a program background? Well, because you can talk the talk. You can talk to people and understand. It's about delivery. And getting that message across. It's all about being there to deliver. It's not about, as you said, putting compliance in the way, putting barriers in the way. And that's how I'm doing it with Oxfam. I'm trying to speak the language of the advocacy people and the program people. And it started to take traction.
Yeah, I would like to build on what Neil was saying. I think the change in the security environment is, in a way, helping us to communicate on the need for security. I think it's pretty obvious, that we're living in an environment that is fairly insecure. But what is difficult to convey is how much it costs and why it costs. And it's not only the hard, security equipment, the improvement of the physical security measures, the armored vehicles, the, helmet and PPEs. It's the number of people we need to make this work. Because when we're operating in Ukraine, we're operating actually in 10 different locations throughout this country. We have daily missions to the border with Ukraine, and it means that we need to have people who are there to talk with the military, to talk with all the authorities, to deconflict, all of our movements, to be able to operate securely. And that costs a lot of money, and it's not a quick, recruitment process, especially in the UN system. So it means that, we need to have some stable resources, and we need to have resources for this, for the people to be able to operate. Thanks.
Very quickly, Paul had talked about it, compliance. Generally in risk communication, there's a tendency to use negative leverages anytime we communicate and we negotiate. But it is possible to use positive leverage, normative leverage when communicating. That means by saying positive leverage, I mean really trying to show, like Neil said, we are security, but we know the program. We know what's more important. Of course, it is important. Security is important. It's part of it, but we know why the organization exists, the raison d'etre. So we also can provide eventually some ways of doing humanitarian work that would allow us to be safe, but also to optimize resources and also to achieve what we want to achieve, the humanitarian impact. That, and the normative, of course, it is about the core values of the organizations. And generally, especially humanitarian organization, we have the principles. Humanity is one of them. And of course, there's a lot of other core values that we have, including the professionality, for instance, in the UN, that allows us to use actually those core values to support, so to say, the discourse, this security discourse. Make sure, of course, resources must be used efficiently, but of course, we need to have those resources. If we have those resources, they need to be used in a proper way. And it's not only because you have radios, you have AVs, but you need to make sure you use them properly, because it is an investment in security, it is an investment in making sure we can deliver also. The crying wolf strategy is not working because, every time and that's generally the risk we face in security, being too restrictive. I remember what Paul was saying, being that in that narrow path of being either too permissive or too restrictive. And security generally is seen as being too restrictive. But again, we need to find the right balance to make things work and achieve the result we want to achieve.
Are there any questions from the floor? I know I'm monopolizing my microphone here. Just like to...
Morning. Thank you. I've been sitting here and I've been thinking something. I've been trying to sort of pull this into a question. I'm struggling to put this into a coherent question. So forgive me, and I'll say something and then you guys can riff off it rather than answer a specific question. It's possibly a slight change of subject or a twist to what we've been talking about. Optimizing resources, collaborative strategies. So sharing resources, I think probably we're quite good at sharing resources. I think instinctively we want to help each other out amongst different NGOs and agencies, and we share resources. Collaborative strategies, what does that look like? Just thinking about the challenges that we face in field security. And one of the things that was bouncing around my head is that while we collaborate and coordinate and we share resources, we're all still responsible for our own security. And access, acceptance, reputation is all part of that. And that can be sometimes a little bit of a drag about sharing resources, because we also have to make sure that we're okay, and we have to think about our access and our reputation. But where we do see, can the panels speak to collaborative strategies around access with non-state armed groups? Because if I think about some of the challenges that we're facing, some of the discussions that are happening at field level is who's talking to that group, who's got access to that group, can we collaborate? What does collaborative strategies look like for access into non-state armed groups? Does that make sense? That's where my head is, and I was struggling to pull out a question from that, but I will now stop and let you guys riff on that.
So collaboration in the sense of, especially around access negotiations, while treading that fine line between looking after your own organisation, but taking advantage of other people's access. Does anybody want to have a go at that? Paul.
So let me see if I can start with the access sort of dilemma problem that you mentioned. So if we look at my point I made about mainstreaming security as a function of managers, it's also about breaking down silos. So the other advantage of that is then if you have a complex problem, like getting to certain armed actors, we need to talk to them. It's a complex problem. Then you're more likely to have everyone around the table who has part of that solution there, instead of being stovepiped. So it could be an issue about who we're talking to. It could be you need legal at the table, what type of group there are. You need public relations there in case you have to, all these things. So that you're more likely to solve that problem if you've broken down those silos and people are seeing each other as problem solvers rather than owning certain things, right? The issue of sharing resources and organizational responsibility, I think, is a very important issue, right? I mean, we are an independent employer. We have independent responsibilities for our employees. It is that reason that we have an argument for sharing, and we have an argument for cooperation, because the problem in front of us is unsolvable in isolation. And so due to our responsibility and accountability to our employees, we have to then cooperate. So I don't think it's necessarily in distinction. And sometimes you get to the place where you go, okay, now this is our responsibility. And often what happens in the UN is we solve it in our own specific way. We have our own human resource and administrative policies. We may have a different policy for giving certain extra payments to staff in certain situations. That's just a manifestation within the organization of a common understanding that we all need to cooperate, and that cooperation is mutually beneficial. I don't know your name. You didn't introduce yourself. Sorry. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I'm Phil, work with MedAir.
Okay, Phil. So Phil, I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried to get both parts of that to see how we solve a problem like that. Thanks.
We can't talk about security in isolation then. I mean, the best times I've done things like access is where we've had a very well-defined access working group where, yes, security people sit in that, but it's not necessarily a security-based forum. As we know, the OCHA access working group, CivMil relations, when we're all working together, that does work. Security sitting in isolation, it misses out on a lot of stuff, a lot of things. I know in a lot of NGOs now, they're having security and access within the one function, which I think is great, because they are starting to think about access rather than just security. And if you start thinking about access, you're bringing in other members of the organisations, programme people, country directors. And I just got a report back. I was asking about how Saving Lives Together is working in some countries, and I got a report back from Myanmar. And they said it's very active. There's a lot of people coming together. I can't remember exactly the details, but they said it's really working well. Everyone's collaborating. We're getting good access working, good information, dealing with a very, very difficult political regime. But because all the different, not just security people come together, other parts of organisations are coming together, they say it's working. So I think that's it. When we look at strategies on how we get better access and better, it's more than just security. And where that happens, it works really well. So that's all I can say on that. I mean, for me in Oxfam, we have someone in a totally different department, does CivMil. And they tend to, I don't even know who they are, to be honest. I just know someone does it in one of the many Oxfams. Perhaps I need to reach out a bit more, but we do. When we collaborate across the board, then I think that works better. And that needs to be more of perhaps a more defined strategy. I know, we sit here, a lot of us are dealing with Saving Lives Together. Then there's the Access Working Group. Well, where's that? There's a slight bridge there. Perhaps that needs to be more defined, especially in the NGO world.
Thank you very much. My name is Zoe Knight. I'm from International Location Safety. I do have sort of a question that's more high level. I think a lot of you have kind of touched on this, but my particular interest is understanding, so taking all the lessons that you kind of identified and understanding how smaller NGOs can learn from that and sort of apply those. So some of the clients that we work with, for example, they struggle to find a way to gather financial resources and other kind of resources to prioritize safety and security. It's not something that is very easy for them. And I think a lot of the time these organizations focus on the very unique and sort of unlikely situations that will have a huge impact. So talking about things like terrorist attacks, but they don't necessarily focus on the day-to-day security and safety risks, such as things like crime. So I'm really intrigued to hear from your perspective, how would you sort of recommend or suggest that these organizations move forward in terms of trying to encourage donors and sort of within their organization to prioritize safety and security on more of a smaller scale on the day-to-day issues, rather than just focusing on this potential huge sort of crisis that could happen in the future? Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe. Anyone like to have a go at that? I think a couple of you have touched on building the case, trying to measure the return on investment of security. Do those lessons translate?
I mean, smaller NGOs do struggle because they probably have a different donor base than most of us. I think one of the greatest resources is sitting beside us, GISF, and that's open to anybody. There's a huge resource there. Even if you don't maybe actively involved, there is swathes of information. And for once, we have it in one location that people can delve in. We encourage local partners to look at the GISF website for, on resource material for risk assessments and on various other subjects. So it's those smaller NGOs need, how do they get to know about those resources? That's a good question. I mean, they should know, but how to deal with donors? I mean, it's going to be, depending on donors. The three major donors that most of us deal with, which is BHA, FCDO, ECHO, you do have to talk about security and risk management. It's part of your proposal, but other donors, especially smaller donors, don't even want to talk about it, and that's a discussion those NGOs have to have with those donors. But a lot of them, you can't even talk about security funding, security risk management, and that's an issue. That's why some of the bigger donors, perhaps then, we can advocate to them to have a conversation with the smaller donors. I don't even know what happened to the good donor practice meetings that used to happen. But, you know, the smaller NGOs do have a problem because their donor bases and maybe getting money from foundations, they don't even know how to spell SRM. So, you know, that's one of the issues we have.
I'll buy you a coffee later for that shout out, Neil. Thank you. But I would also say that INSO and other organisations do a really good job. But you come to the same point though, where although INSO and GISF can support, the NGO obviously has, at the end of the day, responsibility for itself. And I know that for a lot of local NGOs who are at the bottom end of that risk transfer, risk sharing sub-partnership agreement, even if they are getting funding for security, they will be under completely different requirements from different donors. And then they don't have the ability to build an institutional knowledge of safety and security because they're being pulled in different ways. Does anyone else have any comments on this one? Paul. Oh, sorry. Paul.
No, I think that from the UN security point of view, I would say we spent a lot of time after the big changes of Baghdad, Algiers, looking at it internally. And I think that we haven't done enough to go outwards with our learning. I totally acknowledge that. I think one of the reasons that I wanted to be on this panel, we're working on this other thing called the Security Symposium with other organizations. We're realizing now that the UN security system has a lot to teach because we have a unique situation of global presence. We're everywhere where there's trouble, and we're gone from running away to staying in places. There's a lot to offer. And I think that this is maybe now it's the start of the dialogue. And it'd be interesting, not here, but what would be a good way to be able to transfer some of this knowledge. I think we're open to it, and I'm open to it. And I think that this week, as an example of how much we want to speak outwards from the UN, and let's just say it's a start of a dialogue, and let's find ways to do it. I'm open to try. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, just one more thing. I think one of the thing that we're saying, you know, when organization approach us and have the same question is there are two main things. The first one is to build your own framework for accountability within your organization, because there is a responsibility within the organization to take care of the staff. And it's very important, it has to be realized by the leadership, and the leadership will have to be also the one who are conveying this message that Jibril mentioned, no program without security. That's the second element that needs to be there as well. I mean, we're coming back to the basics basically, but you know, these are the two main elements that need to be reminded over and over again to both the leadership and the donors. Thanks.
Sir.
Good morning. My name is Kester Craig. I'm from the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA. So from the dialogue, what I've recognized is that the security challenges is going to continue to grow and become complex. And my question is, are we investing adequately in the mitigation measures and the risk reduction measures? And how effective are those measures? And if we're getting the necessary support to implement those risk reduction measures, because if we don't mitigate, we're going to continue to increase and see the complex impact of security. The other question is, we also recognize that with climate change and other hazards, we're going to see the complexity of security challenges to increase. And do we take into consideration in terms of our further planning, how far out, 10 years, 5 years, how far out do we plan and implement measures to really reduce security issues? Thank you.
There's a two-part question there. So one on risk reduction. I think that plays in quite nicely to that return on investment is not just having the adequate security to immediately avoid an incident, but to get away from that incident happening in the first place. So the integration maybe with how we approach programs in general to mitigate those risks, and then the added complexity of climate change in the future and the risks that are coming over the horizon. Two big questions there. Does anyone want to have a pop at them?
with 3 minutes left. This question of investment in risk controls, risk reduction measures. In the UN security system, we have a concept of security risk management measure and procedure. And why we do it that way is because it's about the involvement of human beings in the systems. And if we were to really look at some of the major failures that have happened, often it's not the measures, it's the procedures. So there's definitely an issue with standards for certain physical security and things like that, but a lot of it has to do with the human interaction. And so I feel the big investment we need to do now is not in more measures, but in making them more effective by getting people involved in them, understanding how to work, and a lot of that training, capacity building, and comprehension of systems for staff. That is really where it's going to make the most impact and most optimizing of resources, in my view. On the future planning, it's a very interesting dilemma we often have. Personally, I think I would rather have a workforce who doesn't necessarily know what's going to happen in 10 years, but is adaptive to what's going to come, rather than spending a lot of time on hypothetical futures of which, so the adaptability and having this, the system that will identify what the changes coming, to figure out what's involved, figure out who needs to get around the table to describe the problem and understand it and adapt to the solution is what we really want, because we don't, too far in the future is going to be very difficult. So I like to focus on adaptability rather than predictability in my view. Thanks.
Yeah, very quickly, because we don't have much time left. We need to broaden the spectrum of analysis. And I think there was a session on analysis last week. We talk about security right now, but there's a lot of things that impact security. We do in security analysis, of course, trying to incorporate those, but the spectrum is not wide enough to incorporate everything. And of course, there's a collaboration that is necessary with people who are dealing with climate, with people who are dealing with economic development, et cetera, many other areas, including even for stabilization. So there's a lot of analysis that needs to be brought together to make sure we can remain adaptive, because it's changing so fast that of course, we need to plan, but still in the planning, we need to be able to be reactive enough, fast reactive enough, or proactive when possible, to be able to cope with those changes. So it's really a collaboration issue, and being able to remain adaptive, I think. Yeah.
Excellent. I think that is perfect timing. So I'm going to say two things. One, OCHA, who are running this conference, have asked if you can have your badges ready as you leave to scan as you go out, just because we're going to keep track of where you're going. But most importantly, I'd like you to join me in thanking our panel, and thank you very much for your attendance and your questions.